Okay, we have people still coming in the room. We'll wait another few seconds as people connect to audio, but we are very happy to have you here for this, what promises to be a very thought-provoking conversation this evening. So welcome to our January edition of the Member History Happy Hour, Conversations at the Crossroads, the spiritual but not religious life of Charles Lindbergh. I'm happy to see that there are many people here on this call this evening, here on this Zoom this evening, that have been with us before, but if this is your first time, we welcome you. My name is Pete Mealy. I am privileged to serve here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center as Executive Director and President of the Seminary Ridge Historic Preservation Foundation. On the museum side this evening, I'm joined by Rob Williams, our Director of Outreach, and Cody Aish, our Director of Education and Museum Operations. Before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about things that we have coming up in the next couple of months and weeks. The big thing that we have on the schedule is on February 26th. It's a Saturday. We are having our annual symposium. This year we are co-hosting with the Battle of Gettysburg podcast, and we will be focusing on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg and welcoming historians James Hessler, Eric Lindblade, and Stu Dempsey, along with Cody and myself, to take an in-depth look at the first day of the battle. So if you are interested in signing up for that, you can head to the events page on our website. This year, for the first time, we are offering both in-person and online options. So this will be a hybrid event. So if you can't make it to Gettysburg, if you want to watch from the comfort of your living room and your bunny slippers, you won't get lunch, but you will get the same talks that you would get if you come here to Gettysburg. Next month, we are going to have another History Happy Hour. I believe it's on the 18th. Cody, give me the thumbs up. Yes, Cody says the 18th. He set it up, so he should know. We are going to welcome historians Scott Mingus and Jim McClure to talk about their new book on York County in the Civil War. And someone we know who's on this call, Cody, wrote the foreword to that book. So we're very happy to have them here, and Cody is going to talk with them about their new book. And then we are planning to start walking tours again in May here on Seminary Ridge. So if you are interested in coming and joining us here in beautiful Gettysburg on beautiful Seminary Ridge, we hope that you will do that, and just keep an eye on your email and our website for more information. So this evening, we are going to hear Christopher Gehrz talk about his book and have opportunities for questions and conversations. Before I pass it over, I would just give you a little bit about the author. Chris has a PhD from Yale University. He is a professor of history at Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota, where he teaches courses on modern European military, diplomatic, religious, and sports history. His most recent book, of course, is Charles Lindbergh, a religious biography of America's most infamous pilot. And he blogs regularly about Christianity, history, and education at the Pietist Schoolman and the Pathos group blog, The Anxious Bench. Chris lives in Roseville, Minnesota with his wife and their 2 children. Before we pass the conversation over to Chris, I'm going to invite Pastor Scott Schul, who serves on the board here at Seminary Ridge Historic Preservation Foundation, to offer a few opening comments and thoughts before we pass it over to Chris for his talk. So Scott, it's all yours.
Thanks, Pete, and welcome everybody. I'm really delighted to have you here. This Conversations at the Crossroads series is an important one for us, not only because we want to provide lots of value for your membership to the Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center, but because it's an opportunity to really, I guess, amplify some of our core mission. Typically, we're going to spend our time in the mid-19th century 1850s, 1860s, Civil War related things. But as I often say, you throw a rock in Gettysburg, you're going to hit 3 or 4 Civil War museums. What makes the Seminary Ridge Museum utterly unique on the face of the planet is our intentionality, as only we can do in that location, of entering into the crossroads of history and theology. And tonight is a perfect example of that. Charles Lindbergh is not a Civil War personality, you know that, but the kinds of things that Chris is able to unpack and unfold for us through a religious lens, looking at somebody who is, I think he says in his book, the most known person, the most famous, infamous person, a person we've all heard about but know very little about. The religious lens of that really opens things for us. And it's an example of the kinds of conversations we want to foster at the Seminary Ridge Museum. I think you're going to hear a lot of things in the presentation tonight. I know you will if you read the book. It's fantastic. That are going to make you think about these same issues as they unfold in the mid-1800s, or indeed as they are unfolding around us even today. So, Chris, I'm wondering if maybe you could start us off by making the case for why one writes a religious biography of Lindbergh, or for that matter, anybody.
Sure. Yeah, well, thank you, Scott, for the introduction. Thanks, Pete. And thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight. It's good to be here. I wish I were there physically for a lot of reasons, one of which I think it's 10 or 20 degrees warmer there. I don't know if that you can believe that, but it was 25 below wind chill when I woke up this morning. So I do want to answer Scott's question and try to make the case for, I guess, A, why do we need a religious biography of someone like Charles Lindbergh? And B, really, to get back to Scott's point about the mission of this institution, why do we talk about religion or theology in the context of history? And so this is maybe just one 20th century example, and hopefully it inspires some 19th century versions that you can figure out as you continue your work at Seminary Ridge. So let me tell you a little bit about, I'll try to actually connect Charles Lindbergh to Gettysburg. And it's very difficult because as far as I know, he never visited Gettysburg. There's not a lot of like Civil War connections, apart from the fact that Charles Lindbergh's grandfather emigrated from Sweden about the same time the Civil War started and came to the state of Minnesota. Here's how I'll try to do it, though. So let me take you back to October 2016. I was on sabbatical living in Appalachia with my parents, and my wife and our twin children, there were 6 at the time, were there. And I was writing a book, and then I was thinking about the next book. And so we had taken a trip to Washington. We had gone to York County to see Amish sites with a friend of mine from Elizabethtown College, and visited friends at Messiah College, and then we decided to go to Gettysburg. And so, of course, we took the tour and saw the hugely important role of the 1st Minnesota and paid tribute in the cemetery. And here's the connection, which is earlier that week, I had gotten an email back from an editor of a series that I'd been talking with, and we were trying to come up with a subject for a religious biography. And I had pitched some topics. And then he said to me, well, you're Minnesotan, Swedish, and tall. You should write about Charles Lindbergh. And so, again, I was finishing another book, but I was starting to think about a new one. And so, like, as I was at Gettysburg, I was starting to think about what became this book, which came out this past August. Charles Lindbergh, A Religious Biography of America's Most Infamous Pilot. And hopefully both the fame and the infamy of Charles Lindbergh will come across tonight. And I think both are worth our attention, both connect to our topic for tonight. But now let's get back to those questions. So first of all, why would you write a religious biography of someone who is very much non-religious? Like, I actually want to call this a spiritual biography, but in the broadest sense, it is religious. And we need to define religion very broadly to catch Lindbergh, who never joins a church, is suspicious of organized religion, but draws on lots of different kinds of religion and kind of comes up with his own version of religion. And that's what I'll try to piece together for you tonight. So that's the first question. I'll come back to that. And then here's my version of the question Scott had kind of hinted at before. And I have to say, when Scott first pitched this earlier, I guess this was my question. What does my book have to do with the mission of a museum housed in the historic Lutheran Seminary at the site of Gettysburg, right? Like, it didn't naturally click to me, but I really appreciate having the chance to think about this, because I've done a fair number of Lindbergh talks, and they've usually been like in a church setting of some sort. And this is different. And so it's pushing me to kind of think about what is this book pointing toward? So let me start with the second question, then I'll circle back to the first, and that'll take us into probably just a short presentation. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So I'll try to complete my kind of preset part in about 20 minutes and leave half an hour. And it looks like Rob's already posted, or Pete's posted something in chat. So if you have questions, you can leave them there as we go along. So let's start with the second question. What is this religious or spiritual but not religious story of Charles Lindbergh have to do with the mission of this museum? So I guess the first thing I want to say is I am a Christian. I belong to a Lutheran church. I work at a Baptist university. The book that I'm going to talk about was published by a Reformed Christian publishing house in Western Michigan. My purpose here is not to proselytize in any way. This is not why I think it's important. And if you read the book, I would guess, except for one or two spots, you wouldn't necessarily know much about my own religion. That's not the point of the book. I think what is important to understand is whatever your personal faith, it is very difficult to understand American history without paying attention to religion. For better and for worse, religion has shaped the behavior, the beliefs, the belonging, so many aspects of American politics, society, culture, all sorts of ways we can take this. But I also know it's difficult for museums to do this. In a couple of months, I'm going to be at a conference in Texas. I'm actually going to be chairing a panel that includes the director of the Minnesota Historical Society, Kent Whitworth. It's actually a group of Christian historians, and Kent goes to my former church, sings in the choir. But I know Kent, like, he doesn't think the mission of that museum is certainly to talk about Christianity. And generally, I think museums often feel a little bit leery in talking about religion very openly. It's difficult to do in a religiously plural country. How do we do this well? How do you do it without offending people? And there are examples of people who do that. I actually think the National Museum of African American History and Culture, because of the importance of the Black church, that new Smithsonian Museum, religion is very important there. But you go right across the street to the National Museum of American History, you have to look hard to find religion in its collections unless they're doing something very special. And so I guess I just want to applaud you for trying to sit at those crossroads, because that's not always easy to think about the relationship of history to theology or to religion. But you can see it in the Civil War. I mean, think about Mark Noll's book on the kind of religious crisis as one way of interpreting the Civil War, and we can do this for so many parts of American history. And so what I'll try to do tonight is to use the Lindbergh story to point at a few different ways we can see religion shaping not just Lindbergh's life, but movements he taps into, or at least in the first story I'll tell you, the public's response to Lindbergh itself is religious, just not in a traditional sort of way. And that hints at this, the other question that I need to answer belatedly, which is, why do you write a religious biography of someone who's not religious? So let me just tell you why I started to write this book and then kind of put all these pieces together. The reason I wanted to write this biography of Lindbergh is that the series that's part of is called the Library of Religious Biography. When it first started back in the 1990s under Mark Noll, it was mostly stories of pastors, evangelists, missionaries, theologians. But in the last few years, they've really tried to broaden the scope and to include people who aren't conventionally religious. And most recently, that's included, there's a Dwight Eisenhower biography that just came out. There was one about Winston Churchill that came out last year. And there are many others in the pipeline. And the reason I was interested in Lindbergh is that he's what I think nowadays we would call spiritual but not religious. Let me just give you a few statistics here. If you look at the Pew Forum, which does religion among its other fields of study, something like 30% of Americans now identify as spiritual but not religious, or they don't identify with a particular religion, but they are not necessarily atheists. They just don't identify with a specific faith, a specific denomination, a specific organization. Or last year in the middle of COVID, for the first time since they started asking the question, Gallup reported that less than 50% of Americans belong to a church, synagogue, mosque, or other religious community organization. Right? This is the growing phenomenon within American religion. It's not necessarily disbelief. It's a kind of skepticism, but it also includes often a kind of spirituality or even a kind of religious life. It just doesn't fit our older categories. And that's the Lindbergh story. He doesn't fit conventional religious categories, but the kind of unknown part of his life, especially in the second half of his life, this is really what he's concerned about. He's concerned about the transcendent. He's concerned about mortality and divinity. He's interested in the ethical guidance that various religions have to offer. You know, we think of Lindbergh, and this is where I'll start, and we think of a machine, right? A plane, technological progress. But as Lindbergh's life goes on, he wants to go beyond the mechanical. He's interested in the spiritual. And even when he tells his most famous story of his most famous flight, he even talks about ghosts being in his plane at one point, phantasms filling the fuselage, speaking to him from beyond in another world, right? And that's, I think, a part of the Lindbergh story that's less well known, but I think is important because this increasingly will be what religion in America looks like. People charting their own path, kind of drawing piecemeal from different traditions to find their own way. And so Lindbergh is an especially complicated, and in some ways, you'll see kind of villainous, troubling version of this. But if religion is still part of American society, we need to start going beyond Lutheran churches and seminaries or other sorts of traditional religious categories to understand different ways that we see religion in American history. So Lindbergh is a 20th century version of that. Okay, all that preface out of the way. I'm not going to try to go through the whole story of Charles Lindbergh. The book is not too long, so if you want to do that, you can. It's not a comprehensive biography. I still recommend Scott Berg's authorized Pulitzer Prize-winning biography if you want to really deep dive. But I would also guess that some of this, at least, is familiar to many people. Maybe less so like the students I teach who are 20. I'm having to explain who Charles Lindbergh is to people who have only known the 21st century. But if you knew anything of the 20th century, Lindbergh probably is part of your consciousness still, right? And so I'm not going to try to touch on all this. I'll leave that for questions. I'm happy to talk about any of the things I skip past, whether it's his upbringing, the kidnapping, the secret family in Europe that only came out about 20 years ago that I deal with very briefly in the book. What I want to do is focus on 3 of these dates here and tell 3 religious stories coming out of these 3 key events, 2 of which I think are pretty well known, the flight across the Atlantic, and then Lindbergh's association with the America First Committee, but along with that, his sympathies for Nazi Germany. And then something that may not be familiar, which is at the very end of his life, Charles Lindbergh threw himself into the work of environmental conservation, the protection of endangered species, campaigning against air and noise pollution, and preserving parks and wildernesses. That was the last great crusade of his life. So those are the 3 stories I will prepare to tell, and then we can certainly circle back to any of this if you're interested. So let's start with what I think is still the most famous Lindbergh story, which is that in May of 1927, a heretofore unknown male pilot from Minnesota got in a plane on Long Island outside New York at Roosevelt Field and took off across the Atlantic Ocean by himself. So there, you might know there had been a big prize, $25,000, the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. 2 weeks before this, people had died trying to do this, flying the other direction from France. And 33 and a half hours later, the Spirit of St. Louis lands outside Paris at Le Bourget Field, and this is the scene. By one estimate, 150,000 people at night took taxis, bicycles, whatever, to get out to Le Bourget and circle the field, and Lindbergh had to be kind of carted away for his own safety. And he became the most famous person in the world, almost literally overnight. So the chapter of the book that deals with this, some of you might be disappointed to know, it says very little about the mechanics of the flight. I am not a flyer. I've piloted a small plane with someone on a date once. That's the extent of my piloting experience. My flight experience is very mundane. In January of 2017, after my sabbatical was over, the next thing I did was take a group of 20 Bethel students to Europe for a World War I trip that I've led a few times. And I remember thinking about Lindbergh as we flew basically on the path that he had charted over the North Atlantic to Northern Europe, thinking, oh, this is boring. This is tedious. I can't sleep. This is uncomfortable. I've done this like a dozen times before, right? It doesn't seem transcendent at all. This is not gripping. I don't understand. And yet this is the response, right? And so here's our first religion story. What is it about flight in the 1920s that evokes this kind of response? And if you really want to dive into this, there's a good book that's been out for a while called The Winged Gospel by Joseph Korn, who taught at Stanford. And I'll just read to you a little bit from the kind of updated edition. So in the 1920s, there was something called the Winged Gospel. It nicely captures the religious excitement with which people greeted airplanes in flight. Aviation was, as one enthusiast put it, a holy cause, and advocates spoke of themselves as its disciples, apostles, and prophets. As such language suggests, aviation was more than merely a technology about which many were enthusiastic. It was a secular religion. The airplane was its god, considered to be a messianic force for beneficial change in human affairs. And he goes on to talk about ceremonies. For example, at Kitty Hawk, if you've ever been there and seen the memorial, December 17th actually is a kind of secular holiday dedicated to the celebration of flight. And Lindbergh is maybe its greatest evangelist or apostle or whatever you want to call him. So here's testimony, I'll put it, from someone who was there at Le Bourget, an American expat editor and writer named Harry Crosby, who left behind a kind of 1920s era stream of consciousness account of what the scene was like. Running people ahead, running people all around us, running, and the crowd behind stampeding like buffalo, and a pushing and a shoving, and where is he? Where is he? Lindbergh, where is he? And the extraordinary impression I had of hands, thousands of hands, weaving like maggots over the silver wings of the spirit of Saint Louis. It seems as if all the hands in the world are touching or trying to touch the new Christ, and that the new cross is the plane. So he's trying to evoke the image of like, these are pilgrims, right, who have come to touch a holy relic. And Lindbergh is not just a man. He is not even just an apostle or evangelist. He is the Messiah. He is a figure heralding a new age in humanity or bringing redemption after World War I, or however you want to interpret this. This is the kind of fervor. I remember reading this quotation when I was in grad school at Yale. We were reading a book by a German historian named Motorist Ecksteins about kind of the before, during, and after of World War I, and Lindbergh is the big featured character in the after. And at one point, I had remembered, like, underlining in grad school, Eckstein said, Lindbergh was literally worshipped and adored. And that's really what the chapter in the book is about. It's not even so much about the beliefs of Lindbergh, because he's very private at this point. He says nothing about himself, really. But the response to him is overwhelmingly religious. Harry Crosby's friend Ernest Hemingway says that Lindbergh is like an angel. Christian preachers liken him to everyone from Jesus to the Apostle Paul to prophets like Daniel or Ezekiel. Right. This is the response. And then he comes back and he goes to every single state. Back in his hometown of Little Falls, Minnesota, you get a crowd like this that tears apart his birth house for relics. Right. And so I think that's the first interesting thing that we might think about here is, I mean, this is religious in a sense. There's a kind of fervor to it and a devotion to it, but it's also invested with hope. And purpose and meaning and redemption and all these things we kind of associate with religion. There's nothing obviously religious about this. And so Lindbergh is the best example I can give you of this winged gospel idea. And then it just becomes a business, right? Lindbergh helped set up TWA, for example. And before we know it, we're with me over the North Atlantic trying to sleep and just feeling bored and frustrated. It's just ordinary. But in 1927, there's still this kind of sense of transcendence and newness and rebirth and renewal about it. And traditional religions will tap into this, but it's really it's a technological religion. The kind of other version of this that I talk about near the end of the book is that the space race takes on some of these same characteristics. And there are all sorts of Lindbergh allusions in the space race. Neil Armstrong is picked, according to Chris Kraft of NASA, because he's like Lindbergh. And Lindbergh is there for Apollo 10 and 11. He actually talks with Alan Shepard right before Apollo 11 launches. And so that's a similar kind of almost religious response that might be a little bit more in our memory. Okay, so that's our first story, and that's what burst Lindbergh on the scene. We can come back to this if you like. I'll skip past the next piece of the story, marrying the daughter of an American lawyer and ambassador, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, the birth, and then the tragic kidnapping and murder of their son, Charles Lindbergh Jr. I'll just say that in 1935, the very end of the year, the Lindbergh family suddenly and secretly flees to Europe, and they live there for the next 3 years. And that takes us to our second story. Because this is the time when Charles Lindbergh really does start doing something like at least a spiritual sort of quest. And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. And it's under the influence mostly of a Frenchman named Alexis Carrel, who's both a Nobel Prize winning scientist and surgeon and a Catholic mystic. And he kind of mentors Lindbergh in this process. But I'll come back to that. The familiar part of this story, you might know, is that in 1936, the US government asked Charles Lindbergh, while he's in Europe, to start checking out the air power of the different European powers. At this point, it's starting to seem possible that a Second World War might happen. And so Lindbergh is there to do his country a service and investigate. And the first place he goes is Nazi Germany, where the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering, is very happy to have Charles Lindbergh come. He sits in Goering's box at the Summer Olympics in Berlin. And he comes back twice more. And this is a picture from 1938 when he meets with Goering, and Goering gives him a medal from Hitler decorated with a swastika, which causes a huge outcry. We can talk more about Lindbergh's reasons then for saying the US should stay out of World War II, but the key part of the story here is that in 1939, the Lindberghs come back. And in September of that year, Charles Lindbergh goes on national radio to make his first broadcast opposing US intervention in the World War that just had broken out 2 weeks earlier. And in 1940, he starts making speeches for a group called the America First Committee, which is a very broad, very diverse coalition, politically, religiously, ideologically. What they have in common is they don't want the US to take part in the Second World War. And you might know that in 1941, in Des Moines, Iowa, in September, Charles Lindbergh makes his most infamous speech for America First, in which he blames the possibility of US intervention on not just the Roosevelt administration, the British, but on, Lindbergh calls them the Jews. And he said, it's hard not to say the Jews should be concerned about Nazi Germany, but that's not our problem. And we shouldn't let them suck us into their problem. And it causes an outcry. And so here we're getting into the infamous side of Charles Lindbergh. And this is what causes his star to decline. His sister-in-law says he started as Jesus. By 1941, he was treated like Judas. There's a lot of debate about this, but it really struck me going into the Lindbergh private papers and including diaries that he took out of his published diaries many years later. This is not some dalliance. Lindbergh admires the Nazi state, and what's really troubling is he sympathizes with its racial aims. A month before this picture was taken with Goering, Lindbergh started writing an article that was never published, and it's probably a good thing it wasn't. It was basically his argument that equality was a false idol, and what we really need to do is cultivate the best of the white race. He asks us at one point in this early draft, shall we submerge the spirit and life of Europe in the yellow of Asia or the black of Africa? And you might, well, what does he mean by that? What does this have to do with anything? Well, the next year in November, he published an article in Reader's Digest making his case against US intervention in the war. And as part of that, he wrote this. Our civilization depends on united strength among ourselves, on a Western wall of race and arms, which can hold back either a Genghis Khan or the infiltration of inferior blood. And an English fleet, a German air force, a French army, an American nation standing together as guardians of our common heritage. And the article says a lot of things. I mean, there are a lot of reasons he thought it was ill-advised for the US to enter the war at that point, but this is the key argument that he's willing to state. This is not our fight. If anything, we ought to be in alliance with the Germans and these other Western white European countries against the threat, right? The yellow of Asia, the black of Africa. I mean, the use of Genghis Khan here is not like some accidental, I mean, he's really talking about is Stalin's Russia, what he called Asiatic Russian civilization. But he's also thinking about China and Japan. Inferior blood reflects his interest in eugenics. How can the white race be strengthened against the racial threats that are coming from Asia and Africa? And this never entirely disappears from Lindbergh. He really believes that equality is a false idol. He has no use for the idea of equality. And instead, he picks up on what he calls the quality of life idea. And what he means is that we need to find ways to enhance the best of the species and the best of the race. And he says racial conflict is part of God's design for the world. What's really troubling about this, and what I didn't expect when I started, is like this goes hand in hand with Lindbergh starting to ask spiritual questions. He's getting these ideas because he is under the influence of Alexis Carrel, this scientist and Catholic mystic who is a eugenicist, who says like there's spiritual decline in the West and there's racial decline in the West. And we need to find ways to enhance the strength of white Western civilization. And for him, that was not just scientific, but a spiritual kind of renewal. So here's from the same Reader's Digest article, a little bit, I think it's earlier in the article. And this is a picture of Lindbergh testing a Messerschmitt during one of his trips to Germany. Aviation carries with it the environmental danger of a people too far separated from the soil and from the sea. The danger of that physical decline, which so often goes with a high intellectual development, but also the danger of a spiritual decline, which seems invariably to accompany industrial life, or of that racial decline, which follows physical and spiritual mediocrity. What's interesting, like, I think the kind of racial views of Lindbergh are not unfamiliar, and they're deeply troubling. They're why people are rethinking naming things after Lindbergh in 2022. What I think is less well known is that for him, it goes hand in hand with spirituality. I mean, the only solution to this is not just military strength, but a spiritual renewal of some vague, ill-defined sort. So that's our second story. And I think that should trouble us. Like it's Lindbergh's way of doing something like religion that enhances his belief in racial competition and white supremacy and anti-Semitism. And I mean, I say a lot more about that in the book. I'll just leave that there. Lindbergh doesn't entirely disappear from public view at this point. In 1953, he writes a memoir of his flight across the Atlantic called The Spirit of St. Louis, which is full of all sorts of really interesting spiritual, intellectual ruminations. It's really actually a very good book. But the next time that he speaks in public after the America First days, it's not until the 1960s when he goes to the Alaska State Legislature and speaks in favor of protecting the wolf population. He becomes an advocate for World Wildlife Fund and endangered species. And even here in 1939, you see this kind of hint of he's concerned that humans are becoming detached from their environment, right? And he comes back to this very late in life in the 1960s. This is an image of Charles Lindbergh on one of his many trips to the Philippines, hugging a tree, quite literally. And so let me just give you a little sample of, in the last 10 years of his life, he really becomes committed to environmental conservation. So for example, he goes to a meeting of environmentalists in Madagascar in 1970 and gives an address, and he says, man and his environment are one. Where his environment deteriorates, he himself deteriorates. In a sense, this is the danger. We can't detach ourselves from the physical environment. We are part of this. We're connected deeply to this. And I think he really means at a spiritual level, we're connected to growing things that otherwise we might be tempted to tear down. He's concerned about deforestation, for example. 3 years later, he comes back to Little Falls, Minnesota, and gives one of his last speeches at what still is the Interpretive Center at the Lindbergh House and Museum. And it's surrounded by a state park named for his father, C.A. Lindbergh. And Charles says, in establishing parks and nature reserves, man reaches beyond the material values of science and technology. He recognizes the essential value of life itself, of the miraculous spiritual awareness that only nature and balance can maintain. And this is the last great theme of his life. It's not just preserving the environment for the sake of the physical stuff of the environment, but because he's convinced that it all is imbued with the divine. I mean, we are all part of something eternal. He calls it the life stream. Lindbergh comes to think that when he dies, his molecules will just be absorbed back into the earth and rejoin the life stream. And here he's influenced by pantheism, by Eastern religion, as much as by anything. In 1970, he writes a letter to a House committee that was considering an American version of the supersonic transport, the Concorde, right? And you'd think Lindbergh would be all in favor of that, right? This great aviator was still consulting with Pan Am in the 70s, but he didn't like it. He thought it would lead to air pollution and noise pollution. And as part of his letter to the House committee chair, he said, man must place more value on the human life stream than on himself as an individual, realizing that he is only a temporary manifestation of that life stream, that his salvation and immortality lie in it rather than in himself. Like, in a sense, our salvation, our eternal existence is tied to our protection of the environment in Lindbergh's mind. And so, I don't think environmental history and religious history often intersect a whole lot. That's not a crossroads I see a lot in my profession, but I think it's an interesting kind of idea, right, that Lindbergh's pointing to. Like, he sees a spiritual dimension to what's happening to our planet, right? You could do a religious history of climate change, for example. It would be utterly fascinating. I have a colleague that I blog with at Baylor named Philip Jenkins, who writes all sorts of stuff. He used to teach at Penn State. One of his most recent books is about how climate change drives religious change, actually, whether it's in the 17th and 18th century or here in the 21st century. But to wrap up the story, because we're speaking of temporary manifestations and immortality, Charles Lindbergh, a couple of years after this letter, is diagnosed at least with lymphatic cancer, loses a lot of weight, and finally in the summer of 1974 is told he has days to live, and so he flies across an ocean, not the Atlantic, but the Pacific, where he had bought a house in Hawaii. And in the last week of his life, he plans his own funeral, picks his own gravestone, and he's still buried there next to a congregational missionary church on the Hana coast. And it's inscribed with part of Psalm 139, verse 9. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. And that's where I will leave off my prepared part. So there are three short stories of Lindbergh that hint at three somewhat related, but in some ways very like disparate kinds of religious stories coming out of Charles Lindbergh. And so if you want to pick up any of those, that's fine. Or if there are other things you want to talk about, I've done pretty well keeping to my half hour, and we've got about 25, 30 minutes left to go. So I will stop talking, take a drink of water, and see where the conversation at this crossroad takes us.
Thanks so much. That was fascinating. I've read most of the book, but to hear you talk and to tell those stories is just fascinating. As I put in the chat, if you have any questions, we really want this to be audience driven. So please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. If you want to use the raise your hand feature here on Zoom, you can do that, and you can unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. Scott, do you have any questions to start off with? I have one, but I'll let you go.
Yeah, I find this fascinating. I'm a pastor in State College, a large congregation, 4 services every Sunday. Excuse me. And I see this spiritual but not religious thing all over the map. It's one of our target demographics, to be honest with you. And you know, to tie this in with our Civil War notion, look at Abraham Lincoln as somebody who did not have a conventional faith, and yet used the language of religion and the stories of the Bible in such a remarkable way. We see Lindbergh also having these questions about faith and struggling with orthodoxy, however we define that, but unable to apply it in the same way. And so, Chris, I'd like to offer up three little vignettes from your book as well that sort of, I think, show this indecision of Lindbergh, these guardrails he keeps bumping up against. One is the kidnapping and murder of his son. He ends up calling, as any father probably would, he kind of refers to a God of chance, gives up on the notion of a God of mercy and grace. And then on the other side of World War II, you mentioned beautifully in his book about how he kind of rights some wrongs there with a very understated participation, even flying missions in World War II. But he sees the aftermath of the atomic bomb. And so all of a sudden now he's realizing science, which might have been his God at one point, is in need of serious moral guardrails. And so that kind of veers him back on the other angle, looking for some sort of a faith. And then one of the themes that struck me throughout the book that is as modern as today's headlines is this notion from Lindbergh, and frankly from many others, that I like Christ, but Christianity, I'm not so crazy about it, at least as exemplified by its members. So are those sort of the three themes that keep playing like a cycle in his life? Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the only kind of hesitation I would have with saying that is the first 30 years of his life are a little bit of a cipher as far as his spirituality goes. If we know anything about, for example, religion in his childhood or his adolescence, it's from much later in his life when he's looking back and starting to write memoirs, autobiographical material. His reaction, like, what did he think about all these pilgrims trying to grab reliquary pieces of his plane and like he didn't like celebrity, clearly. I mean, he really came to treasure his privacy. That's why they fled to Europe in the end. It's not clear what he thought about the kind of the notion of like flight as religion. He was never as unrestrained in his fervor as some other people. Like there were people who do this wing gospel thing who really feel like it's going to like utterly transform us, bring us to heaven in a sense. He writes about meeting a woman in the South who, I don't know, maybe seriously says, "Can you fly me to heaven?" Right? Like it's not clear what he thinks about that. But yes, otherwise, like that seems to be the tension. Like, I mean, as he goes through this journey from like the 30s until his death, and he's trying to find something that's beyond science, something that restrains science. You know, on the one hand, he admires religion. He draws on its texts, on its leaders, and on its ideas, because he does come to see there's this danger. And World War II really is a turning point. He sees what scientific progress attached to technological development unleashes. I mean, he flies over Hiroshima at one point. He's on a mission to study bombing damage in German cities, and he's just horrified this is standing in a line from the Wright brothers and from the Spirit of St. Louis, is this kind of devastation. He says, like, we've got to find some way to rein this in, to say that just because we can do these things doesn't mean we should. And religion gives us one of those ways. At the same time, and I think, as a very religious person myself, very understandably, he is offended by the hypocrisy of organized religion. And he's such a lone eagle, so to speak. He never could abide the idea of being like bound by a community, right? Like that deeply offends him. He finds that dishonest. He finds it stultifying. And I get that. And I can see that, like, in my students, right? Like, why should we have to agree to be part of a tradition, a community, a denomination? Why can't we find our own way, right? And why can't we find something that isn't marred by, in many ways, the very troubling history of Christianity in this country, or of religion more generally? Can't we make our own sort of path? And I think Lindbergh gives you a kind of glimpse of what that can look like. It also ends up being kind of troubling, like, because it's not restrained by, there's no one there to tell him, hey, wait a minute, maybe equality is a good thing. Hey, wait a minute, maybe racial competition is not something to celebrate and to push forward, right? Like, and he chooses to avoid those kinds of ideas and messages. So, I think I probably leave in a pretty ambivalent place when you get to the end of, like, so what does this mean for religion, or what does it mean for the future of spirituality or something? I don't think I have answers to give them, but I think Lindbergh at least kind of helps us think differently about these topics.
Chris, I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on Lindbergh's relationship with Alexis Carrel. It seems to me that you say in the book that he after the kidnapping and the murder of their child, that they're looking for some sort of answers. They're looking for some sort of framework to make sense of this. And you mentioned that his wife takes some console in the outpouring of religious support, but that Charles doesn't. And it's kind of right after that. They flee to Europe, but it's right after that he takes up with Carrel. And I'm wondering if, is that him creating a framework to deal with that, and then it just kind of snowballs maybe from there?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty reasonable speculation. If I don't connect the dots more clearly, it's because Lindbergh refuses to connect them. Like, he does write later very glancingly about the kidnapping and the murder in a book. Let me see if I can pull it off. So this was the book he spent 20 years working on that was published after he died. Autobiography of Values is a very weird book. It's not a conventional memoir. It kind of flits around. It's full of these vaguely theological ruminations. And so, like, in that section, he doesn't say, well, because of the death of my son and the tragedy, it led me then to Carrel and to think, well, what is beyond this world? Is there something beyond the physical? Is there life beyond death? But he does kind of hint at that. And he had been working with Carrel for a couple of years earlier, and he says in retrospect, I always did have these questions. Church just didn't give me good answers, but Carrel started to give me a way of thinking that even a man of science needs to think beyond the physical, right? And think rigorously about the supernatural. So I think that's very likely that then becomes this really important relationship. But unfortunately, right, as I've mentioned, and maybe we'll get to a question here about eugenics more, like, part of Carrel's spirituality is the sense of quality of human life requires not just improvements in medicine and physical treatment, but also, like, spiritual quality, and should be used to enhance the species, right? And that means what's called positive eugenics. We should find ways to encourage the right kind of people to have children and to play influence in our society, but it also means negative eugenics, right? It means, how do we restrain the lesser parts of our population, or what Lindbergh called the inferior blood, right? That's coming from Carrel as well. Like, there's no evidence of that in Charles Lindbergh's writing until you get this relationship with Carrel in the 1930s. And then, of course, add Nazism to the mix, and that's what burst forth in 1938-39.
Great. We had two questions that have come in on the Zoom chat. Robert asks to speculate how Lindbergh could value the environment more than human beings. I'm
not sure he would say that he does. I think he would want to say, like, the future of humanity is tied to the future of the environment. But there are moments where it seems like he sure loves trees and birds more than he loves anyone else. There are even moments where it seems like he speaks more lovingly of them than of his own family. Right? Like I do think there's something where he just gets drawn to this life stream notion, right? And instead of focusing on the life that's all around him, he's kind of like happy to go off into the wilderness for a while. At the same time, what I skipped over that I should really hasten to add is he's really interested in the 60s about people who live in very close contact to the environment and whose livelihoods and way of life are threatened by industrialization and deforestation and development. And they're what he would call primitive peoples. So specifically, his kind of first encounter here is he travels in 1962 to East Africa to spend time with the Maasai tribe in Kenya and Tanzania. And he returns to that part of Africa several times. Pacific Islands is his other big passion, and the Philippines especially. At the end of his life, he's advocating for certain kind of Neolithic groups that he saw as being threatened by the mainstream Catholic population of the Philippines. So in that sense, like his crusade for environmental protection is also tied up with, he sees himself kind of paternalistically as saying, I want to protect these poor innocent people who really do know what it's like to live closely with the land, who understand the spiritual meaning of nature. And so in that sense, he really cares about that life, or at least he says he does.
We have another question from George, who asks, after the details, pictures, and accounts of World War II concentration death camps were revealed, did Lindbergh ever make any comments about this aspect of the war?
And he did. It's fascinating. It's kind of troubling. So in 1945, well, actually, I should back up. I think Scott or Pete mentioned this. In 1944, Lindbergh actually participated in World War II. He secretly was deployed to the South Pacific, flew 50 combat missions, came back to the States, and at the very end of the war in Europe was part of a naval technical mission to go investigate essentially German military technology and science. So this led, for example, to Werner von Braun and other rocket scientists eventually coming back, to the US to help with what became the space race. While Lindbergh is there, he not only visits like ruined, bombed out cities like Nuremberg, but he also visits a place called Camp Dora. So this is a sub-camp of a concentration camp in central Germany, and it provided slave labor for the production of V-2 rockets. And so this is not an extermination camp like Auschwitz, Treblinka. This is one of the 100+ concentration camps in the system that had been built up. But many of the people who worked there, which included Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, and others, they were starved to death, they were worked to death, they were tortured to death. At least one of the SS commanders from this camp was sentenced to death as a war criminal later. And Lindbergh writes in his diary that he keeps during and after the war about being just utterly horrified, to see heaps of ash that used to be human life. And so in that sense, it does chasten him. And when he starts to write then about the lessons of the war, I mean, he does say like this reflects the dangers of what the Nazis were doing. He's able to step back at least enough to say, these were people who come out of this Western civilization, come out of what he calls Christian civilization, but they were so infatuated with the power of technology, they had no ethical guidance, right? And so he does kind of take that lesson. But what's kind of troubling is he mostly engages in what I think you might call moral equivalency. He steps back from this concentration camp and says, well, but this really is not unusual. He says, Americans did this to the Japanese. That was his experience of being in the South Pacific, is that really, and it truly is a horrendous way that Americans treated Japanese prisoners sometimes, and then conversely, how the Japanese treated American prisoners. Lindbergh has a pretty dire view of humanity at the end of World War II, and so he is prepared to kind of just chalk up the Holocaust to, well, it's just it's just part of a larger thing. There's nothing really special, unique about this. And as someone who teaches the Holocaust about every semester, that it was a very troubling part of the Lindbergh story to me. Like, I wish he could somehow step back and recognize the anti-Semitism led to this, right? The kind of diminution of a certain part of the human population that could allow 6 million people to die. He doesn't really speak to that. Unlike his wife, and I put her up here in case people have questions about Anne Lindbergh, when she publishes her diaries kind of right before and after her husband's death, she comes to this part of the story and she admits at several points, this is difficult because I was wrong and my husband was wrong. And she talks about the Holocaust, and she says, I didn't want to repeat World War I. I didn't want another 10 to 15 million people to die, but if I had known what was going on, if I had talked to the refugees that Charles Lindbergh scorns privately, I would have understood the need to go to war against Hitler. And so unlike her husband, she takes that lesson away from the war. He's much more muddled about it, I would say.
A handful of times in the conversation, you've talked about how he is viewed today, and we were talking about names of things that are named after Lindbergh being changed. So I'm going to ask the traditional historian question with the bad answer, but how should he be remembered today?
I will say I have no vested interest in anything being named after Charles Lindbergh, in any statue being erected to Charles Lindbergh. I mean, as a historian, I really don't care about that. I do think the way you remember someone like this is you do what we're doing right now, or people like me, if we have the wherewithal to do, you write books. I think there is something valuable in studying people who are this complicated and really most deeply are this troubling. I mean, the one thing that's bothered me in the response to the book is people who say, well, how dare you write something about someone this awful, right? Or I would never pay any attention to someone this anti-Semitic, this racist, right? And I want to say, like, man, there's not a lot of Americans then we're going to be able to write biographies about. And like, so are we only telling stories about heroes, right? I mean, in my religious tradition, this is where a biography comes from. We tell stories about heroes of the faith and we gloss over all their faults, right? Is that what we want to do instead? Only to find that those heroes were actually not so wonderful either. Like, as a historian, I want to be truthful about Charles Lindbergh. I want to be empathetic as much as I can. And mostly I want to tell his story because through it, we can think about the lives of other people in the story. Like it all starts with the story of immigration, really, is kind of where I'm coming at it as a Minnesota historian. But I am coming as someone who teaches about the Holocaust. Like, it should make us then think about the experience of the Jews and think about why it was awful that Lindbergh says what he does about the Jews. And I didn't even quote the really offensive stuff he says about Jewish refugees. That's just utterly appalling. He tries to take out of his published journals. Like, that's why I tell the story. It's not to glorify Charles Lindbergh. It's not to erect a kind of statue to him that we celebrate when we walk by. It's because he is a flesh and blood, multidimensional, deeply complicated person whose story points us towards other kinds of stories. Like, I was doing a talk last month before Christmas at a church, and I asked them, well, so why do you read biographies? Like, why is this helpful? And some of them said, well, because they're heroic figures and it's inspiring to read their stories. But one person said, well, I like World War II, but it's such a big topic. I like to start with a biography because one person's story is a good kind of like gateway. And I thought, that's great. That's what I like about a biography. It's a gateway into all these other kinds of history. And so if you do read the book, like, I know footnotes are off-putting to some people, or endnotes, like, look at the footnotes, because that's where you read then other people writing about, here's what anti-Semitism looked like in the United States. Here's what eugenics was in the United States and why religion was very closely connected to it. Here's what immigration looked like and how Swedish Americans like Scott and my ancestors eventually started to think that they were white, not Swedish. And some of them started to join the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. Like, that's, to me, the power of a biography, is it gives us a way into the complexity of history. I mean, in some ways, the same way that a museum does, right? It makes it knowable and manageable, and it sparks further questions and further curiosity and interest.
Well, and my big line that I stole from Pete Carmichael at Gettysburg College is, you should leave a museum with more questions than you have answers. And I feel like you should leave any good book, but especially this one, with more questions than answers. And I'm sorry, Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, Pete, I want to piggyback on what Chris was saying there. This biography and biographies like it not only give us insight into the past, but I find a template for understanding the present. I mean, the same reason I study the American Civil War. I think it offers all sorts of insight. I mean, think of Lindbergh. You mentioned in the book his youngest child, Reeve, speaks of how they were home churched. And that was probably a novelty when she said it. Now it's the norm. Mm-hmm. And Lindbergh himself was home churched in the sense that civil religion and some sort of mishmash of public ceremony formed him, at least initially. But what I want to have you really focus in on, Chris, is how the 1920s formed at least one element or one version of his spirituality. Because the parallels you drew to our time were shocking to me.
Mhm.
A time of great income disparity, a time when we're kind of war weary, traumatized by war. That sounds familiar to our time. A time as well with fast-paced technological changes. I think around today, if the 1920s are repeating now, is that why Elon Musk is a hero to many? Is that why Steve Jobs was before? Talk to me a little bit about how a time or an era forms our spirituality and sort of then dictates history from there.
Can I just add 2 quick points? One is that I was thinking of Elon Musk a lot as I was reading this. And second, you do write at one point about I think this is exact words, reliance on technology, abusive environment, and celebrity culture. And I was like, wow, when have we seen that before?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think historians sometimes are a little bit chary of saying, well, here is the present day application for something, because like I just love the past for its own sake. But the other thing I tell my students, like, people of the past are radically different, except in all the ways they're similar to us, and we can understand them. And there is something about the 20s that's very perceptive, Scott and Pete. Like I mean, there are moments where I catch myself thinking, like, what is the way forward, right? In the midst of all this change and the kind of divisions and the weariness, like, I mean, I can understand the sort of longing for a messianic figure to herald a new way forward, someone who's going to break through and do something remarkable that we can all rally around and worship and adore. Like that's not too surprising. And in the 1920s, it probably helps that he looks, as people said at the time, Nordic. One of the most fascinating sources I found were African-American responses to Lindbergh's flight, which was admiration, but also like, can you imagine what would have happened if there's been a black guy piloting the plane? The response might have been a little bit more complicated in the 1920s. But I mean, there's a part of me that thinks that you could have written the same book and the focus would have been a little bit more on the sort of religiosity of celebrity. I mean, the kind of fervor and devotion we attach to whether it's technological innovators or athletes or musicians or Instagram influencers or evangelists or politicians, whoever it is, like, man, that's a recurring theme in American history. And Lindbergh's a particularly shy, private version of that. But as I note in the book, it's also the era of Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney. And eventually we'll get Hollywood actors will kind of fill that role as well. And as a Christian, as an American, I want to be pretty cautious about that too, because it's easy to see the kind of pathological things that grow out of that, both for someone like Charles Lindbergh himself, who just feels hounded, right, by the kind of attention he gets because of his celebrity. But also, I mean, there's something dangerous about us worshiping and adoring another human being for something they've done, right? And we should maybe pause and sit up and wonder, how are we doing that here in the 21st century?
So we're coming up on 2 minutes here before the hour. I do want to mention that Mary said, "You have helped me better understand my father, born in 1921, who later went on to become extremely interested in aeronautics, which became his vocation. He was also German Lutheran and was really interested in Charles Lindbergh." So
good, great.
Thank you. So. Does anybody have any final questions? I know I have one, but I will. It's an easy one. Don't worry. But I will. Chris has just put the links in the chat to the book. I have mine on Kindle, which is great, which I love now. Chris, I'm just interested. What are you working on next?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I kind of want to turn back towards teaching. I'm due for another sabbatical. And so I'm trying to think ahead to next year. And mostly I'm trying to say maybe doing this in the middle of the pandemic is not the right moment to start developing another project. And I kind of want to sit back, but I'm kind of at a point in my career where I actually want to reflect on what it means to teach and to do history. And so I have a couple of ideas related to that. So I would love to do another biography at some point, but it's a weird thing to immerse yourself in someone else's life, let alone someone this complicated and in some ways troubling. So maybe another 10 years, I'll come back and do a different biography of someone.
And you mentioned footnotes earlier. I'm in a PhD program right now. So my job in life is to gut books and read footnotes, and very, very well researched and use of primary and secondary sources. So you brought that up a little bit earlier, and that was something that didn't go unnoticed on this person that's looking for them right now.
Right, I understand.
Well, it is 7:29, and I want to thank you all again for joining us this evening. I hope that you learned a lot, both about Charles Lindbergh, but then also about thinking of ways to look at historical figures, and historical eras through a religious lens, and something that we strive to do here every day at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. And we hope to have many more of these conversations as we move forward through the year. So on behalf of myself and Rob Williams, Cody Aish, Scott Schul, I thank Chris and everybody here for joining us this evening, and I look forward to seeing you all on the Ridge soon. Thank you.